Chile's Constitutional Convention approved two major changes in the country's constitution, including presidential re-election and the creation of a unicameral Congress. The first reform, this thing about presidential re-election is extremely delicate. This is extremely delicate because we need to remember this has always been the first change that authoritarian leaders execute in Latin American nations in order to remain in power indefinitely. This basically happened, of course, in many countries around the region, such as, for example, Cuba, Nicaragua, and of course, Venezuela. So the second reform, this thing about creating an unicameral Congress, is also a pretty controversial one, because creating this type of power is also another action that Latin American leaders pretty much execute every time they can in the different countries of this region in order to get a better grip of the legislative branch. This second reform, this thing about creating this unicameral Congress, is nothing more than the clearest attempt to control the legislative branch on these countries. And in this case, we're talking about Chile. So this is quite delicate because we need to remember that Chile's newly elected president, Gabriel Boric, he had as his main political background being the leader of the pro-constitutional reform during the recent protests. So it is quite possible that he will take advantage of his role as the leader of the executive branch. It is quite possible that he could take advantage of his role as the country's president, not only to support this constitutional change, this constitution reform, but also to publicly support and make efforts for these two particular reforms to get approved. These changes, of course, will go into voting once the constitutional reform starts in a couple of months, in a couple of weeks. This is going to take place. So these two changes about the presidential re-election and the creation of the unicameral Congress is going to enter into a voting session into which members of the legislative branch are going to decide whether they could approve these two changes or not. Both reforms were executed by the Chavismo in Venezuela once former dictator Hugo Chavez got into power. He had the majority of his party on the legislative branch of the Congress and the Senate, and they took advantage of that political position, of that majority, in order to make these constitutional changes. So what is taking place in Chile, it is pretty similar to what was going on in Venezuela, to the things that the Chavismo started to do in Venezuela. Of course, this doesn't mean that Chile is going to end like Venezuela. This doesn't mean that at all. However, it is not impossible, and in addition to the fact that it's not impossible, we basically have to recognize that these two constitutional reforms that were basically approved by the Chile's Constitutional Convention were the same that the Chavismo approved in Venezuela during the first years of that nightmare, of course. So this is not exactly a great sign, but of course we're going to see what is going to happen, and we'll be informing you about everything that takes place in Chile here on this channel as always. Reporting from Medellin, Colombia, Luis Orozco, Newsweek.